Hey there! Have you ever wondered how we go from having a simple question to getting a solid, evidence-based answer? Today, we're going to break down that whole methodical journey researchers take to turn curiosity into actual, concrete knowledge. So let's get right into it.
It really all boils down to one big question, right? In a world that's just swimming in opinions, how do we figure out what's really true? This isn't about just guessing or going with your gut. Nope. It's a structured process, a real journey from a question to an answer you can actually verify. And that process has a name.
Empirical research. Now, that word empirical might sound a little fancy, but all it really means is that your conclusions are based on concrete, verifiable evidence. We're talking about stuff you can observe or experience in the real world. It's all about drawing conclusions from tangible proof you've collected, not just from some idea you had.
Okay, so if we're going to base everything on evidence, the very first step is figuring out what kind of evidence do we even need? I like to think of it like a detective standing in front of their toolkit. The tool you grab totally depends on the mystery you're trying to crack, right? So the first big tool in that kit is what we call quantitative research. And if you hear quantitative, just think quantity. This is all about the numbers. It's about collecting data that you can count, that you can measure, and then you use statistics to find patterns, maybe even make predictions. It's the numbers game.
And then you've got the other major tool in the kit, qualitative research. Now, if quantitative is about quantity, qualitative is all about, you guessed it, quality. This isn't about counting things at all. It's about understanding. It's where you gather the non-numerical stuff, the stories, the images, the observations, to really explore the meaning and the context behind something.
So, let's boil it all down. Quantitative research is all about the numbers. It asks, how many? So you can see the big objective patterns. But qualitative research, that's about the narratives. It asks why or how to get into that deep subjective context. You could almost say one tells you what is happening and the other tells you why it's happening. Numbers versus stories.
Okay, to really see how these two different ways of thinking work in the real world, let's zoom in on one specific tool that researchers use all the time, the interview. Now, don't get me wrong, they've got tons of other tools, right? Big surveys, focus groups, you name it. But the interview is just a perfect way to show how the approach you take completely changes the kind of answers you get.
All right, first up, let's imagine your goal is purely to collect that hard, quantitative data. You just need the numbers, plain and simple. Well, to do that, you're going to use something that feels a lot like a very strict questionnaire.
And this has a name. It's called a structured interview. Think of it as being super rigid, totally standardized. Every single person who participates gets asked the exact same questions, in the exact same order, and they have to choose from the exact same list of answers. There's zero wiggle room, no going off script.
And you might be thinking, wow, that sounds super strict. But there's a really good reason for it. By keeping everything so locked down and identical, and by using these closed-ended questions, multiple choice, yes, no, the data you get back is clean, it's numerical, and it's super easy to compare across like hundreds or even thousands of people.
Here's a perfect example of what that looks like in practice. The question is super direct, and the answers are all laid out for you. You can't add any color, you can't explain why you visit or what it was like. You just pick one, and boom. The researcher gets a nice, clean, countable piece of data.
Okay, so now let's do a complete 180. Let's flip the script. What if you don't care about counting at all? What if what you really want is to understand a deep, complex story? Well, for that, you're going to want to have an open conversation. And this approach is called the unstructured interview. And just like the name suggests, there's no script, no fixed set of questions. It's designed to feel more like a relaxed, natural, flowing conversation, where the researcher can just explore ideas and topics as they pop up. So the key word here is really freedom. The whole point is to get that rich, descriptive, qualitative data, the stories. And to do that, you have to give the person you're talking to the space to give you really thoughtful, open-ended answers that come from their own opinions and experiences, not from some checklist you made.
I mean, just look at a question like this. There's no way you can answer that with a simple yes or no, right? A question like this is really an invitation. It's saying, hey, tell me a story. Share your perspective. Let's really dig into this complicated issue together.
So let's just recap that really quickly. On one hand, you've got structured interviews. They're great for big groups. They give you objective, number-based data that's pretty easy to crunch. On the other hand, you've got unstructured interviews. They're better for smaller, more focused groups, and they give you that subjective, story-based data. It takes a lot more time to analyze for sure, but the depth you get is just incredible.
But what if you're thinking, hey, I kind of want the best of both worlds.
What if you need a little bit of structure to keep things on track, but you also want that freedom to explore interesting ideas? Well, good news. There's a hybrid for that. It's kind of like a guided discussion.
This is what we call the semi-structured interview. And it's a really powerful mix. See, the researcher comes in with a guide, basically a list of open-ended questions they want to cover. But, and this is key, they have total freedom to ask follow-up questions, to probe deeper, and to follow interesting ideas that just pop up during the conversation.
So the whole flow is really dynamic. You kick things off with one of your prepared questions, but then your main job is to listen, like really listen. And based on what you hear, you ask spontaneous follow-up questions to dig deeper. It's this beautiful dance between having a plan and just letting the conversation flow naturally.
And this question right here is a fantastic example of a starting point for one of these interviews. It's open-ended, it invites a real story. And once the person starts talking, the researcher can jump in with those little probe questions like, oh, that's interesting, can you give me an example? Or, wow, how did that actually make you feel? See how that works?
So what's the big takeaway from all this? It's actually pretty simple, but it's so important. The tool you choose literally determines the answers you're going to get. Whether you end up with a giant spreadsheet full of numbers or a rich collection of personal stories comes down entirely to what questions you decide to ask and, just as importantly, how you ask them.
And that brings us to a final question, and this one's for you. Think about a big problem, maybe at work or in your own life. When you have to solve it, what's your first instinct? Do you immediately start trying to count things, to measure, to find a pattern in the numbers? Or do you start by just listening, by trying to understand the story behind it all? The answer might tell you a lot about how you see the world.